Well, welcome to the last Kernza Cafe chat series of this winter. Again, my name is Matt Leavitt. I'm the agronomist with the University of Minnesota Forever Green Initiative. Thanks for being involved in this call series here today. If this is your first time or if you've been along for the whole ride here, really appreciate everybody's involvement. Because really the growers are kind of the heart of this effort at getting this crop off the ground. So really appreciate everybody's time and commitment to being a part of this. I will make a quick note too, that while this is the last of this series, this definitely won't be the last educational event for Kernza this year. So I will be reaching out to you folks once some more information about field days in the region, other items like that become available. We'd certainly like to keep you all in the know about that. And it's an open invite as well. If you all have ideas, would like to host people at your farm, if you have ideas for field days, future educational programming, we definitely would love to hear from you about that and want to make sure that whatever we're planning for the future is responsive to your needs as possible. So that's me. Also on the line here is my colleague Sienna Nesser, the CLC adoption specialist with Forever Green. Done a lot of work on the back end of a lot of our programs and has been pretty integrated with Kernza even before I started here at the U. So there's our contact information. Please feel free to get in touch at any time with any questions that come up, outside of agronomy or inside as well. So just as a little recap about where we've been and where we're going. So we've kind of touched on some of the common FAQs that have come up, at least in my year or so working at the university with Kernza, that kind of fit into the general questions buckets that growers have asked. And we did record all those presentations. You can find them online on the Forever Green website, and we definitely encourage you to share those with folks, or if you missed any, to reach out as far as that goes too. But today we're going to be focusing on one of, kind of the, I would say, underutilized potential of Kernza as a crop, which is its forage value, both as a grazing crop and a haying crop. So we have two producers, Wendy Johnson and Stan Vander Kooi, both utilizing Kernza in kind of different parts of their rotation and also different uses, one grazing and one kind of haying specific. And then Al Kraus, who's been a big Kernza champion and partner in Southeast Minnesota, kind of talking about some of his work with producers down there grazing the crop as well. So I think we'll have kind of a well-rounded on-farm view of Kernza as a forage crop. So just want to remind everybody that we're really pleased to have everybody along. We do want to try to keep the line open as much as possible for growers of the crop to get their questions answered. So if you could please type your questions in on the chat as they come up, or you can feel free to unmute and ask your question as the talks go on here. We really appreciate having your involvement there. And just as another plug too, we definitely want to hear from you as we're creating and thinking through new programming for this year. So with that, I'm just gonna take a look and see who's on the line here. So Stan, since you're on the line here, would you like to kick us off with a quick outline of how you've used Kernza as a forage crop? I do have your testing results pulled up here. Whenever you want me to share that, I can certainly do that.
Okay, I think I'll go through the production side of what I did first, and then we can bring up I got a rotary combine, so I combined my Kernza with my rotary combine. I did not I got a 13 or 15-foot swather, so I basically run a 15-foot wide windrows. And so I got a pickup head of my combine, so I just combine it. I did not rake the two windrows together. We just baled them with a New Holland round baler. And I got about 330 bales altogether, about 600-pound bales, which equal to about 99 ton. And I got paid about $8,000 for those bales. So basically, I was grossing about $91. I was grossing $133 an acre on those Kernza bales are equal to $91 a ton if you want to look at it on a per ton basis. So I'm pretty happy about that because basically it paid my rent almost on the land. So that was a good deal. And if I count the cap money that came in, ended up being about $10,700, which definitely paid the rent on that 50 acres that I had. So that was, and the guy that takes those round bales has horses and cattle, beef cattle. So for him, he kind of uses as a feed, of course, and somewhat bedding if they don't eat everything. So he really likes it because it's a nice soft grass, you might say. And so it really works out well for him. And he only lives about a couple miles from where I'm at. So it's pretty easy to haul the bales over to his place. And he's happy with it. They're not wrapped bales, they're just string wrapped. So he doesn't mind if they're string wrapped versus net wrapped. Net wrapped would probably be a little easier to handle them, but the round baler does a pretty nice job of keeping the bales intact. And so we can haul about 20 bales at a time on a couple hay racks and things like that. So, and I have a friend that I farm with, and he hauls all the bales for me. So it's kind of nice. He grabs them all and loads them on his with a tractor and loads them on the
for people that aren't familiar with where you're at, just give us a quick overview of where you farm,
sure.
How many acres of Kernza you've planted, and kind of how long you've planted the crop too.
Okay, that's a good point. Good point, Matt. I live basically by Buffalo, Minnesota, which is west of the Twin Cities, about 40 miles. And the major portion of those bales came off of 50 acres that I just rented this past year because the lady was tired. The people that own this 50 acres, and it's a real nice 50-acre field, pretty square, long rounds, so it's not a lot of corners. And she didn't like the corn and beans that the guy was using before, so she wanted someone that would plant it organically and not use sprays. So I kind of fit the bill, so I planted it all to Kernza with I have a no-till drill, so I dug it a couple times because it was corn stalks and alfalfa before that. An old alfalfa field that basically got tired. Half of it was an alfalfa field that got pretty tired. Dug that up with a rototiller, and then I got a high-speed disc that I tilled the other part with, and plus the alfalfa ground with the disc. And I got a 10-foot no-till drill, so with 7-inch spacing, so I really got a nice stand. I mean, the stand was just great with the Kernza. And I have a sponge drive drill, so it's really easy to calibrate it and get the correct amount of seed per acre or whatever the case might be. So I got a nice stand, and so there was lots of forage, you might say, on that field as well. And the Kernza yield was probably right around on clean, I'm guessing right around 200 to 250 cleaned per acre. I haven't cleaned it yet, but I'm just guessing that because we got about 500 pounds an acre, and usually my combine does a pretty decent job. So I usually end up with about 50% clean out in the past anyway I have. So it's hard to know. But, and then Matt, you want to bring up I sent in 2 years in a row, I sent to one test went to DHA lab in 21, and this past year I sent a sample to Dairy Nut Labs in Sauk Rapids, Minnesota for 23. And the first one that you show there, Matt, as the 23 one, average on a crude protein base was 6.95 crude protein. And ADF was 40, NDF 67. So on the bottom line, way at the bottom, the relative feed value ended up being 79.99, which is not too bad, actually. That's a decent feed value for beef cattle if they want to use it as a forage before calving and that type of thing. So moisture was 13.5%. And so really, it was nice and dry, so it's going to stay in good quality. And the other test that I did in 21 was pretty much the same, a little lower protein on the one from the DHA lab, but actually the relative feed value ended up being 79 on this one as well. So both relative feed values were 79. So guy was pretty happy with the stuff, and he likes it for his horses and his beef cattle because it acts as a feed. And then if you have some bedding, kind of the rest kind of ends up as bedding. But it's better than straw, he said. So it works out well for him. So
Okay.
production wise, I was pretty happy. I think I figured out about 1.65 tons per acre of forage, going back to the forage side of it again.
And how does that compare to, say a grass field that you chop for dry hay? Just
Well, dry
overall
hay
feed value wise and tonnage wise.
Well, on a dry hay basis, if it was just hay without any alfalfa in, the protein would probably be right in that same ballpark, actually. Just strictly dry hay. Relative feed value probably be higher because you got a little more stock in the Kernza than you would on a regular grassy hay. Relative grass hay is probably 120 to 150 relative feed value as a straight meadow fescue grass hay that a guy might use for feeding cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So ton wise, in a first crop grass cutting would probably be right around that 1.5 to 2 tons an acre on a one crop grass cutting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with the dry weather we've been having, our grasses would probably not yield too much more because the grass is kind of dried up last year. But this Kernza, on this good soil like that, it really did yield quite well, both forage and Kernza itself. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And this was just the harvested straw post grain harvest. This wasn't you harvesting anything in the spring or the fall.
No, I never. I've talked to people about harvesting, taking a cutting off in June or whatever, and then letting it grow back. And basically they said, well, it's probably not worth it. I don't know, to cut it early before it gets a seed head or whatever, So you have to really watch it carefully, I think, to get it cut before you gets into what's the stage, Matt? Milk stage or before the milk stage even? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the important thing if you're going to cut it in the spring is to watch out so you're not clipping the seed head. Because that's your grain yield if that's what you're going for. So yeah, it's always a trade-off, between those two stages. And some of the folks, Wendy and Al, might have some more feedback on the grazing end of things, because I'm sure they're probably grazing at that time frame as well. But what'd you put down for fertility, if anything?
Nothing really. No, I did spray it with I'm organic, so I got sprayed with a couple gallons of fish and a gallon of what we call our SP1 was a biological, gallon of biologicals, and 3 gallons of potassium sulfate, liquid potassium sulfate. So I blend those in together in a foliar mix to spray on that. So this coming spring, I'll hit it again with probably 5 to 8 gallons of fish and a gallon of biological and 3 or 4 gallons of potassium sulfate. And I got access to a new product that has lots of humates in, called Premium 21. It's got humates in, so I'm probably going to get a couple gallons of Premium 21 on there, which is a humate product. Yeah.
Got it. And there was a couple questions that came through the chat here. What was the harvest date on the grain again?
Oh, August, middle of August, end of August, I would say. Yeah, end of August. I should look. I got that someplace here.
How long did it have to dry in the windrow?
About 4 days.
Okay.
3 to 4 days, and was ready to go again.
Mm-hmm.
It was still pretty green, actually, and when we round baled it. Yeah.
Okay. And there was another question from Carmen. Why would Kernza straw have higher feed value than regular straw like wheat or barley or oats? Yeah, great question. I don't know if I have an answer to that. If anybody else does, feel free to chime in.
I never tested any straight oat straw, but I know it's not going to be that much protein in oat straw.
Mm-hmm.
if I can jump in, I just wanted a question for discussion. I think the part of the reason is that the Kernza straw is still green when the grain is ripe. And so
Yep.
there still is some feed value in it. So it's drying down a lot like a regular forage would do when you're harvesting it.
Yeah, because it's after you run through the combine, it's green laying on the ground after you run through the combine. And the Kernza was, my Kernza tested at 13-14% moisture as well, the actual Kernza. So,
Good. Because I think that's important to remember, because otherwise you'd look at it as a straw and not as a feed value. But if you know those numbers that you gave, Stan, those are great numbers to have, then it makes all the sense in the world to use this as a feed straw product. And I know it works good with our cattle as well here in Madison.
yeah. Well, you know that people, in some cases on a TMR and a dairy ration, they'll throw straw in the ration to give it a little fiber,
Right.
you might say, or a little scratch factor. Well,
Right.
why not use Kernza as your scratch factor in a TMR ration for dairy cows, you know, for example. Yeah.
And did you have to do any education with your hay customers about what the stuff was, or did you just kind of give them a little bit and then they tried it out, or what? How did that
Yeah.
process work?
2 years ago, he tried it, and then I told him what the protein value was, and then last year he wanted every bale that I could get. So,
Okay.
I mean, for him, protein's not a big deal, but he likes the greenness of it, and instead of feeding this high value alfalfa to them, which they don't need in many cases, horses don't anyway, and beef cows in the early part of their breeding don't need a lot of high nutrient cap field either until they're getting ready to calve, maybe 2 months ahead of time or something like that. Because he has alfalfa. He buys some alfalfa from me too as well, straight alfalfa.
Gotcha. Yeah, and just as a, probably not telling anybody that, something that they don't already know, but I mean, intermediate wheatgrass was originally brought to this country as a forage crop, and it's had a good long track record, especially out west, for that use for a long time. So yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things I preface this conversation with is that it's a very good, if you have a market or can investigate a market for a dual use potential, that Kernza can provide a lot of value there, even up and above the value of the grain, just from its characteristics as a finer stemmed, cool season hay or forage grass.
And yeah, and you try to swathe it, you don't swathe it right down on the ground. We remove the swathing about 4 to 5 inches above, so there's pretty good stubble left. So it lays pretty nicely. So that helps in the drying process probably too. So
yeah, and as I recall, it was fairly long straw too, wasn't it?
Oh, it is. Yeah, I mean, you're walking in hip deep stuff before. Yeah.
Did you have to size it at all before you wrapped it up, or like cut it down a little bit more?
No, not really. No,
Okay.
I don't think I understand your question. Maybe.
Well, you didn't have to further chop it up. You could just bale it up as it was.
Right. The rotary combine does a pretty good job of breaking it up to begin with.
Okay.
Compared to a conventional combine, but it's a rotary combine not beats it up, but it's easy for a guy to feed it because it doesn't have all this long stuff in there.
Gotcha. That's great. Any other questions for Stan and kind of his system and baling up Kernza more generally? And there's, I can answer this. There's question, is the straw from combine or is it regrowth? And this was the straw from harvest.
Right. And so basically I should get another 2 to 3 years out of it because it should be good for another 2 years, right? As a Kernza.
Yes. Yeah. And if you were to keep it, just strictly as a forage crop, I mean, it could stay there for, a decade.
Yeah, my plan is after 3 years, depending on what the Kernza yield is to no-till alfalfa into the Kernza. Because a lot of horse people like that grass alfalfa mix.
Got it. Well, I really appreciate that, Stan, you sharing your information with the folks on the call here. So we're going to transition to talking about Kernza as a grazing crop. And again, if you have questions for Stan as we go along here, please feel free to ask more questions. But I'm going to invite Wendy Johnson to speak. And Wendy, before, in case folks aren't familiar with you and where you farm, if you just want to give us a bit of geographic labeling about where you're at and how you've used Kernza in your rotation, that'd be great.
Sure, I have a small slide presentation if I could share my screen too, Matt.
Yes, please do. I think
Okay.
Sienna can make you a co-host there.
Yeah, you should be able to share, but I can make you a co-host too.
I just go to share screen.
I'll make you a co-host.
Doesn't let me.
Okay.
I farm in Northeast Iowa, Floyd County. We are not quite the Driftless. We're about a county and a half over and about a county south of the Minnesota border. And I planted 45 acres of Kernza.
You should be good to go. I think you're co-host now on sharing screen.
I just click share screen. Comes up with an exclamation point, like,
Weird.
it's not gonna let me. Here, let me. 1 second.
If needs be, Wendy, you can email me the link and I can drive for you.
Okay. Should have tested this beforehand. Here.
It's okay. We're all used to Zoom and technical slowdowns, so no worries.
Oh, let's see. Hopefully it's not too big. I'm sending it to you now, Matt. So just I guess to start out, a little background. I decided to grow Kernza. I was really excited about the grain. And because it's a forage too, I was doubly excited. In addition, we have been going through a drought here the last 3 years. And so when I planted Kernza, I was kind of thinking it might be a drier year, and I think these deep-rooted systems could really be helpful both for forage and for grain. So that's kind of the decision making on why I decided to grow it, even though the market is still developing on the grain. The side factor was the grazing opportunities.
Okay.
If you could.
Okay.
So I did kind of a timeline. Again, this is my first year growing it. I planted it early September 2022. And so these are pictures from 2023. This was August 24th. This was after we had windrowed it. So this is the Kernza in the windrow. And you can see that it's green still underneath. And that's not weeds. Yeah, so it was windrowed. There's some windrows there. If you go to the next slide. This was August 26th. We had harvested it for the grain, and then the bales are still some in the field. And let's see, if you go to the next slide. this is what that green is. So Kernza is a bunch grass, and so you can see it still, even though we took the straw off, there was some time when we windrowed it, from the time we windrowed it and cut the grain and everything, cut the stem off. This is the regrowth from that plant, from the bottom up. And this was not very long after we had cut it, or windrowed it. I think it was about a week or 10 days. End of August here in Northeast Iowa was incredibly hot and incredibly dry. We had an overall, I think through the growing season, we had 12 to 13 inches of rain, where we average about 36 inches a year. So we were incredibly dry, and I was incredibly surprised that there was still green after we harvested. And it wasn't like, when we grow some rye, it wasn't like rye where you take it off and it germs. You know, it might germ again as a kind of a cover crop, the stuff that's spit out. This just kept growing. So move forward a little, or one slide up. So our average bale weight, what I did was fertilizer was expensive. I had applied, let's see, about 2 ton an acre of poultry litter, which equated to be about 100 pounds of N. This was in fall of 2022. And so I probably overapplied my nitrogen or poultry litter a bit. But the previously I had had oats. And so I was concerned about some of the potassium available for the straw, or for the Kernza. And so my average bale weight was 710 pounds. I only did half the field. I was really curious. First of all, I didn't know how it was going to feed out, or if anyone was even going to be interested in it. I didn't want to get stuck with a bunch of bales of straw and then I couldn't move it, because I don't have that many. Our sheep and livestock, we have sheep and cattle. We have about 115 ewes and their lambs, as well as I custom grazed 25 cow-calf pairs. And then we grass-fed finish our lambs. So by this time, my lambs are still with their mothers. We feed them all together. We don't wean them until they get sold, which is in December. Or sorry, November. We wean in November and then they're sold in December. So these are lambs that pretty much they've been weaned from their mothers. They're just all together eating. And so that's a little background on what's eating this stuff. But the straw bales, I didn't want to get stuck with a bunch of straw bales and not know how it was going to be palatable for animals. So I did half, and then half the field I spit out the back of the combine. I shredded it, chopped it up more, because fertilizer is expensive. So we'll see what things look like this year in terms of, because I haven't added any extra nitrogen to this crop. I got $35 a bale, so I was really impressed, Stan, with what you got for your bales. But there wasn't a lot of people knocking at my door for Kernza straw. There's not a ton of livestock producers in my area anymore. And they mostly get cornstalk bales for $15 or $20 a bale. So my yield was about 35 bales on 20 acres, about a 1 3/4 bale per acre. Next slide. This was my analysis that I got. It was just a free analysis. I don't have a relative feed value on here, and I'm sorry that it's quite small, but I just typed in my crude protein value was 5.24 on this was for the straw bales. I don't really know how to read forage analysis. So if Matt, if you have any insights on that. But I just look at crude protein, and that was the buyer of these bales, the 30 so bales he was interested in. He actually got this test. It says 22% moisture, but absolutely was not 22% moisture. It was bone dry. It was so dry. And he kept those, he's still feeding out some of those bales because he mixes it with cornstalk bales and some alfalfa bales for his cattle. And they would have molded by now if I had 22% moisture. So I don't think that's quite accurate. But some feedback I did get from him was a different experience than Stan. So the bales, when he puts out a corn stalk bale, a Kernza bale, and an alfalfa bale, obviously the cows go toward the alfalfa bale, but then they go to the corn stalk bale, and they go to the Kernza bale last. So they weren't too excited about the Kernza bale. He didn't know why, if it was like palatability, if it was texture, or what exactly it was. So I'm not sure if he will buy again, but that was just his feedback for me about the Kernza bales. Okay, next slide.
Well, while we're on the slides, Stan, do you have any feedback on the values? I mean, I'm not a forage expert by any means, but I know NDFD and, which is neutral detergent fiber digestibility, and digestibility of the fiber is really important with grass.
Yeah, it's probably a little on the high side on the NDF. My lignin was relatively low, or about average on mine. The lignin itself, which is, you would think that'd be helpful. You have to remember, corn stalks, if they have a little bit of corn in them, that's why they're going to go for it first. If there's any little bit of corn or leaves in the corn stalk bales, so they're probably a little more palatable from standpoint. I can see legume going first, but the best thing he could have done was to get a tub grinder and put them all in one big mix, and that would have been a problem.
Yeah, that's what he suggested. He thought it'd be really good for a TMR situation, just like you had mentioned earlier, Stan.
Yeah, that would be great. Then you'd really get the fiber and everything else in there as the protein. So that'd be an ideal way to handle it for a regular TMR or a dairy guy.
Hey Matt, if I could just talk for a second. I'd like to second what Wendy had to say. I've put some Kernza bales out myself. But I think they are in the stage that they're harvested, they're more akin to straw than they are to hay. And if you were to harvest it primarily as hay, kind of post that 3-year period where it's really good for grain, I think you would have success in feeding Kernza hay, as long as it's not close to the grain harvesting phase where that lignin's high and the proteins.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I mean, like I mentioned, people use this as a forage crop routinely in mixes in drier areas out west. And yeah, if you're harvesting it at a more optimum time for the grass, you're going to increase those forage values pretty significantly.
You can go forward, Matt. So here's Matt at our field day. We hosted a field day in early September. I kind of go through this timeline just so you can see what the forage looks like. So you can see there's cows out there. I had 25 cow-calf pairs that we custom graze. I put them out there shortly after we removed the bales, end of August, because there was enough green up, and they were happy as clams out there. If you go to the next slide, I really like to see cattle and sheep ruminate and sit down and relax, and they were very relaxed. And oftentimes they'd eat in the morning, eat at night, and in the afternoon they just loaf, which is really what I see as some success in terms of they're getting what it is they need. We put out a buffet of minerals and salts, kelp and such, and it's not touched. We didn't have to fill it the entire time these cattle were in there. And I have a timeline coming up here. If you go to the next slide, maybe. So this is September 16th. By this time they've been on there for about 2 weeks or a little over. Still, you can see a lot of green there. It never looked like they ate anything because it just kept growing, I think. They clip off the tops and then it would just keep growing. So it never really never really got very tall, but it never got very low to the ground either in terms of what they were grazing. And we rotationally grazed, but I did not do that in this field this last fall because I was testing it to see. I had no idea like were they going to get enough from the Kernza forage just by itself if I put them in just like 1 acre paddocks, for example.
Wendy,
Yep.
what were they grazing? Were they grazing new growth new growth leaves, or were they grazing the stems from the cut grain?
This is new growth. The green is the new growth.
So it's the leaves that are coming up off of the stems.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Next slide. This is September 24th. In the foreground, that's a cool season forage. It's winding itself down because it was very hot and warm in September still, and so it kind of was starting to it had shut down actually a while ago and didn't really start back up. But the Kernza's in the foreground. It looks very brown because when you cut the straw is kind of at the height of the straw stem that's connected to the ground is about the height of the grass or the growing Kernza beneath it. So it just kind of looks brown, but there's quite a bit of green in there. Next slide. So that's what it looks like as it's growing back. This was October 1st. And there were some areas I wasn't too excited or happy with my windrower. I asked a neighbor to windrow. I don't have my own windrower swather. And it was a really old machine. And so his heights were not consistent. So sometimes he'd be lower, sometimes he'd be higher. And it was, he's probably 80 years old too. So he was a little up and down in terms of getting it cut. Plus it was an incredibly hot day. I offered to do it myself. I was worried about him, but he really wanted to use this machine. So the straw lengths or the stem lengths are really uneven throughout. But the one thing that the sheep, eat differently than cattle, and the sheep, they get closer to the ground a bit. And so the straw would rub up against their wool on their necks and cause wool loss. So I don't know how to resolve that exactly. I didn't want to take a roller and like roll the straw down so that there could be more, or roll those stems down. I didn't know if that was going to help or not. So I just left it and they did fine. They just lost some wool around their chest. Next slide. Here's middle of October. They're in the foreground again. They're still grazing. They're fine, happy grazing it. But by the time it was about end of October, we noticed that they were not as excited about being there anymore. And so we have a temporary fence there that separates our cool season pasture from the Kernza. And they were starting to kind of get through that temporary fence a little bit. With sheep, if you've ever dealt with sheep before, electric wire doesn't really bother them. They'll go through it. It's more of a visual barrier, but you have to make sure that they're happy where they are. That way they'll stay in, even with electric fencing. So when they're not, then they're ready to go and they'll just kind of walk through the electric fencing there. So we removed the sheep end of October. So I got a total number of fall grazing days of 60. And with my cattle and my sheep with their lambs, we had about 65 animal units. So it's about 1 animal unit per acre there for a couple months. Next slide. This is middle of November, still quite green. I probably could have kept grazing it, but it was very matted by this time to the ground. I also, this is a sheep, why it's bare right there. It's a sheep trail. Sheep don't like to they don't really like to graze where they don't want to trample what they're going to eat. It's really an interesting thing, kind of like deer do as well. They create kind of trails, and they follow those trails instead of like cattle will just walk on everything, where sheep create these little trails. So I thought that was really interesting. But the picture on the right, you can see some of the new growth that had germed, again, with very little rain. I think I had quite a bit of grain loss. My harvest equipment was it was a neighbor who had a fairly new combine, and he was very nervous about tightening it up because the seed is so small. And in retrospect, I probably, if we harvested for grain this year, I'm trying to find an older combine, someone who has a pickup head that can harvest it for me, that's more comfortable with tightening it down. So I think I had some loss, which I think my grain yield, I didn't put it over a scale, but I think I'm estimating my yield, this would be bin run bushels, about pounds, is around 350 to 375 pounds an acre. But it's very clean, almost too clean. So that's how I know. I think my combine guy spit a lot out the back. All right, next. And this is January. We had a few bales that we saved to feed our sheep and cattle, and I just have a handful of cattle, but mostly sheep, and they really went after it. So I had a different experience than the guy that bought the bales, but they went after it and they cleaned it up. Though I don't give them options. So I don't give them options of other things. I give them a bale, they have to clean it up. So this, they're dry anyway. So they're not like probably not gaining too much, but they went through this bale quite quickly. Next slide. And then these are my dry ewes. They're these are some of the dry ewes, and they went after it too. So I was really surprised that sheep are pretty particular on what they like to eat, and they went after it. And our sheep are in very good condition. It's not like they're very thin or anything, and they really actually liked the Kernza bales. All right, next slide. So here's some of my income. I sold about $1,000 worth of bales, but to bale it costs about $600 because I don't have my own baler. And then I had a custom grazing thing going on for about a month, and that was $1,500 in income. But the real cost savings, or the cost savings for me, is the big deal. It is for me is I didn't have to buy hay. Since we were so incredibly dry, I would have had to purchase hay to finish out. I didn't have enough stockpiled forage. The cool season pastures didn't grow back very quickly. And I didn't have enough stockpiled. So the Kernza field really saved me a lot of money to be able to graze it. And it was an experiment. I didn't really know if they were going to be satisfied, and they were. So that was a really good sign. Again, this is just my first year doing this. So it was all kind of an experiment. Next slide. I think this is my last slide.
There was a question in the chat, and I think you maybe alluded to this earlier, but the sheep, did they eat the leftover straw, or were they mainly focusing on kind of the newer growth below?
Newer growth. Yep, newer growth only. They weren't that interested in that stem that was existing there. So this is our Kernza field. I took this picture end of January, I think it was. I really like that it captures a lot of snow. All that straw that's up, every bit of moisture counts, I think, these days. And so I'm glad that I could capture snow, where if I look across the road at some tilled fields, there was a lot of dirty soil that had moved, as well as there wasn't any snow on those fields. So that's an added benefit to having some straw left out in the field. So what's next for me? This week I plan to get we have no frost in the ground anymore. So I'm going to try to get a soil N analysis to just see if I have any N left, because we had such a little amount of rain, and I had put on 110 pounds of nitrogen, actual nitrogen. I'm hoping that there's some nitrogen still in the soil profile. That'll determine whether I add more or not. And then near green up, I'm going to get a forage test analysis when there's some growth that I can actually test that forage to see whether what it is, what's in there. And I could either graze it until the joint stage, I'm guessing mid-May. Someone else here could tell me if that's not correct. And then just determine what kind of year we're going to have by May or so. If it's very, very dry, I might graze it the entire year, or hay it, graze it and hay it both, or take it for grain and graze it like I did this last year.
One of the
That's
reasons
it.
why, when you look at the test, my sulfur levels are relatively pretty good. And if it's got good sulfur in, that's why they're going to eat it, because it has some basically a salty type taste. So that's one reason why they're eating it, I think, because it's relatively good in sulfur, according to my test anyway.
Great. Well, this is awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy, for taking the time to share your experiences here. I know it's kind of a new experience for you in terms of incorporating it into your rotation, but I think that's pretty valuable to be willing to share your experience. So thanks very much for that. And again, great questions in the chat too. Keep those questions coming. In the last 15 minutes or so, going to transition things over to Al Kraus from Clean River Partners, and he shared his presentation with me. So just bear with me while I pop that up here. And Al, are you there?
Excuse me. Hi, Matt. Yeah, here we are.
Okay.
And if you've got the slides, then I won't bother trying to do sharing screen on myself here.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and do that. So go ahead.
You want to get it into a slide mode. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you again. I'm Alan Kraus. I'm the Conservation Program Manager here with Clean River Partners. We're a small nonprofit located in Northfield. And what I wanted to share with you here this afternoon yet, and I'll have to ramp it up fast. Is it a sharp quit time at 2 o'clock, Matt? It is.
You know, that's the end time, but you know, we've gone over a handful of minutes, so no big rush. If people want to stay on, I think that's great.
Yeah, great. Well, this is a really great conversation. Anyone that knows me talking about Kernza knows that I'm really also interested in the forage aspect of Kernza, but frankly, I'm really interested in the dual use of Kernza, right? The fact that you can grow forage and grain from a perennial plant, really unique characteristic of a really unique plant itself. So what I want to share with you today is this a case study of a farm down here near Cannon Falls, Minnesota, so southeast Minnesota, that we took a look at, like basically what happens to the grain production of Kernza when you graze it, basically. And initially we thought about just grazing it in the fall, but we ended up grazing spring and summer. So this project began in 2018. You can see what some of that forage looks like up there. And what we did was we set apart some spots. You can see where the Kernza is a little bit taller inside the fence nearest to where the signage is. That was areas that we left ungrazed. And then we grazed the other portions. And we did this in replications, 3 different replications across a 6-acre field. We tracked both the grain production inside and outside of those exclosed areas, ungrazed areas. We also tracked forage production in both of those areas. And we did that from 2018 through 2022. If you want to go to the next slide, Matt. Just wanted to show you, we no-till planted this back in 2018, basically late August, early September there. So a no-till setting. It was burned off with glyphosate before we it was still a little bit green when we got out there and planted it that day on the 10th of September. You want to go to the next slide, Matt? Would be fine. There was our first cutting of grain in spring of 2019. We did not do anything with the Kernza. We didn't try to graze it or harvest any forage from it. We were really focused on establishment of the plant at that point. And you can see that we took it as a direct cut late August of 2019. If you want to go to the next slide, what we did was we had the harvest from that grain, a really good grain harvest. We have all the data on that. If I remember correctly, we had 600 pounds of bin run seed that year in that very first year. Go to the next slide. You'll see that we baled up that immediately post-harvest forage residue that was left over there. This was a big part of what Stan's conversation was earlier, looking at that material and the value of that material as a feed source for livestock. Wendy as well looked at using that material. And in Wendy's case, she looked at a late fall, early winter grazing program as well. And if you go to the next slide, Matt, you'll see that we did the exact same thing. Post harvest, the regrowth material late fall. Again, we grazed portions of the field and then we left some portions ungrazed, and we did that for 3 consecutive years. You go forward, we'll share some of the results of that. This is basically the timeline of activities that happened on Caleb Anderson's farm. You can see the fall of 2018. I mentioned we got it planted. Spring of 2019, we did spray with the allowed 2,4-D product, so it was not organically managed. Everything from that moment forward, however, on the crop was an organic management system, except for that early glyphosate and 2,4-D applications. So then you can see we moved through the summer, we grain harvested, we applied liquid manure, we fall grazed it in 2019, we grazed it in the spring of 2020. We applied liquid manure after grazing. We harvested the grain in the summer of 2020. We applied liquid manure. We grazed it in the fall of 2020. We grazed it in the spring of 21. We harvested the grain in 21, the summer of 21. We grazed it again in the fall of 21. Very aggressive management of the forage on this material. And we really put the cattle on it in terms of stocking rate. We wanted to remove up to 90% of the forage residue that was available to the cattle. Then again, we grazed it in the spring of 22. In the summer of 22, the farmer elected not to harvest the grain. But really, frankly, there was a severe drought in this area and he really needed the forage, which speaks to the versatility of the crop itself. Instead of being required to take the grain harvest, it was available. He put his cattle on there. We actually did harvest the grain heads that summer ahead of the August 25th grazing period there. So we knew what the grain yield was going to be. We hand harvested the grain, and then he still grazed it, and the cattle still took that material out there right down to the ground. It was very, very palatable yet for them at that time. And then in the fall of 22, there just wasn't enough rain to really accumulate any forage. And so that really ended this particular project. I'll just let you know that in the spring of 2023, the farmer did apply glyphosate, no-till planted soybeans in there, and it was an absolutely terrific crop of soybeans following Kernza production. If you want to go to the next slide, this is just showing you what the grain yield was from basically 2019, 2020, and 2022 from those enclosed areas. Those are the ungrazed areas, and then the blue is showing you the grazed areas. And you can see that each year, all of that, each year after year, grain production did decline on both of those systems, being either grazed or ungrazed. If you go to the next slide, Matt, you'll see that oddly enough, by the 4th year, where we had grazing happen, the grazing actually, those plots actually increased in grain yield. If you go to the next slide, Matt, we show you that while both the ungrazed and the grazed sections declined over time, the ungrazed sections in terms of grain production declined at a more rapid rate than the grazed sections. We don't know why that's going on, but we think it's an interesting result. And we actually have a second farm, a second case study happening right now where we will continue to track this going forward. If you go to the next slide, forage yield. There were some earlier comments about, what kind of tonnage they were getting off there. We have all of that data. And you can see here, this is tons of dry matter per acre. It really bumped up in that year after the seeding, right? That first, by 2019, we were really starting to get some forage production off of there. 2021, and then finally in 2022, we actually don't know what that summer yield was. That was the year where he grazed the forage crop in August. We thought Caleb was going to go ahead and combine it in August, but I called out there just to see how it was going, and he informed me that he determined he had to graze it, and it was already grazed, so it was too late for me to go out there and collect that summer forage. I did go out late fall of 22 just to see what was out there left for forage, and I mentioned that there was so little rain in 2022. He elected not to even put the cattle out there. He could have, but I did take a sampling, and you can see there was not much forage of any kind due to that really dry conditions by the end of this project. I think I've got another slide or two, Matt. We looked at forage quality. Both Stan and Wendy mentioned about relative feed value. You can see that these relative feed values during spring was the highest, and the fall regrowth was pretty high compared to the summer. And the summer, we're really looking at that immediately post-grain harvest straw, if you want to call it that. That's the residue that's remaining that's fairly dry. I will comment that there's been some talk about whether or not the cattle go to the dry bales and consume it. Caleb mentioned to me that he put out some alfalfa bales alongside the Kernza bales for his beef cattle. You saw them out on the field. They went to the Kernza bales and ate those bales before they ate the alfalfa bales. Of course, they weren't pure alfalfa, but still, for whatever reason, I think we're just pointing out that there's a lot of variability, frankly, in my mind, in terms of that dry forage material that comes off of the immediately after the combining, and depends on how many days it has to sit there in the windrow. I think impacts whether or not it's palatable for cattle when you're trying to graze or trying to feed that dry material. But boy, clearly they love that spring forage pre-harvest. That's very high quality feed. And then that late post-harvest, late fall regrowth makes some really high quality grazing for cattle.
You remember how long it stayed out in the windrow in those years? Was that a handful of days?
Well, again, the first year, when Caleb really found that the cattle really went for that Kernza forage material, he direct harvested it, right? So he cut it with the combine. It laid in the windrow for about 2 days, or maybe a little more than that now that I think about it, and dried out enough for him to dry bale it. I think there was a photo earlier of the bale itself. It was yellowed, but it wasn't where it had to lay in the windrow with the stem on it and then get run through the combine in a more of a formal, windrowing and then combining it with a pickup head scenario. So a lot of factors, I think, go into what the quality, how palatable that dry bale really is for cattle. I do believe also that Kernza has a great spot in dairy rations, in dry cow dairy rations, in TMRs. I think Kernza has a really good place there. Might have another slide or two. We did try to take a look. We did some enterprise budgeting, and Matt, I don't know if we want to share this out too much. We put together a full brochure on this information, but we kept track of all of the costs, expenses, and revenues, and calculated the net on this project. And you can see on the far right-hand side that the average per acre per year is about $205 net. And I think if you click one more slide, you're going to see.
Does this include the grain sales, or is this just
This
forage?
includes grain and the value of the forage. I made a note. We valued that that grazed forage material that was of higher relative feed value at 7 cents per pound. I valued the dry material in the round bales that was, you know, the straw, if you will, at 5 cents a pound. And I made a note, given the prices that Wendy had for her bales, that came to 4.9 cents a pound. And Stan, you sold your materials at 4.55 cents per pound. So our price is at 7 cents a pound for that higher quality grazed forage. Seems about right. We took those prices off of the market value at the time, by the way. And our price is about 5 cents a pound for the dry material. Seems about right too. And I always like to include this little slide just to, if you click one more, this is margins here in Minnesota, southeast Minnesota, for corn production over the last 10 years. And this slide is starting to get a little bit dated now. This was put together by the University of Minnesota folks. Here in southeast Minnesota, the average net per acre over a 10-year period for 200 bushel corn is just about $60 an acre. And you can see how our Kernza budget sort of mapped up against that over the project year at about $200 an acre. So there's opportunity with Kernza is the point here. There's versatility with Kernza. Can be used both for grain and for forage, both in the same year. With the ability to utilize it only as forage if needed, or to take only the grain if you don't have the forage. We put together a case study where we looked at both things happening in a grazing situation. So we're up against time here now, Matt, but I appreciate the opportunity to share one of our case studies. I think that's my last slide.
Okay, thank you very much, Al. And just to reiterate, there's a question in the chat. This is conventional sale economics, not organic, correct?
Yeah, this is, we valued the grain that was actually sold to a buyer for $1 a pound in the first year and then $1.50 a pound every year after it. Bin run.
Gotcha. That's awesome.
Yes, land cost, we charged the actual rent per acre that Caleb was paying for other land. In his case, it was $200 an acre. And I'll just follow up. We built the enterprise budget working with Bill Lazarus at the University of Minnesota, ag extension economist. And I got a little bit of financial background myself. So yeah.
Okay.
We have that study available, Matt, for anybody that wants it.
Yeah, I believe Sienna shared it in the chat. And that's something we can follow up with this group as well after we wrap up here. So any lingering questions for any of our presenters here, Wendy, Stan, or Al? Okay, well, hearing none, again, just want to appreciate and say thank you to all of the speakers today, Stan, Wendy, and Al. Really appreciate you taking the time to put together presentations. Thank you to all of you as well for joining us for all this series. And like I said, we'll be in touch with you as the season goes on here with other educational events on Kernza moving forward this year. So until we see you again, take care.